So one of the other types of learning that's pretty important in psychology is something called operant conditioning. And this is a different way in which people and organisms can learn using tactics that are not necessarily found in classical conditioning. So we're going to take a look at that today. And operant conditioning is sometimes referred to as instrumental conditioning. And the reason why is because you use an instrument in order to get an organism to learn. So the main idea behind operant conditioning is that an organism learns to make a response to a stimulus in order to get a reward. So they learn to respond because they know that if they respond, they get something. And the response action that they have, or the response that they do, is not an action that's typically associated with a particular reward. So that's what's unique, is you train them kind of to do this thing that is unnatural or would not necessarily lead to something, and get a reward that is not kind of normal. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. And the kind of the two names that are associated with operant conditioning are B.F. Skinner and Edward Thorndike. And Thorndike proposes what he calls the law of effect, and that is the idea that a behavior is more likely to recur, to happen time and time again, if it is reinforced. And so he wants to reinforce that behavior as either being positive or negative, and that would then cause that behavior to recur more often. So in order to test this and work through this, Skinner designs what's known as an operant chamber, or more colloquially known as Skinner's box. And Skinner's box is empty except for two things: a lever and a hole. And the hole is designed to put food pellets through. And so Skinner trains rats to press the lever in order to get food. And it's not like that just starts like that. He uses a process called shaping. Or it's also sometimes referred to as, down here, this nice long term, differential reinforcement of successive approximations. So you can imagine why we refer to it as shaping, because it's just easier to deal with than differential reinforcement of successive approximations. But essentially what happens is that as the rat gets closer and closer to the desired behavior, you give them rewards. So for example, in shaping, the way it works is a rat receives food for being near the lever. So if the rat moves near the lever, they get food. And so the rat's more and more likely to go near the lever. And then the rat receives a reward for touching the lever. So now it recognizes that it gets the reward both for being near and for touching, and so that's a positive thing. And then eventually the rat receives a reward for pressing the lever. So the rat starts to recognize this process of they get what they want as they get closer and closer and eventually start pressing the lever. And by the end, the rat is only rewarded for pressing the lever. So the rewards for getting near the lever disappear. The rewards for touching it disappear. But when they press the lever, the rewards still continue to exist. And so that is pressing a lever. Again, when we talked about this concept, the response is an action that isn't typically associated with obtaining a particular reward. Pressing a lever is not generally associated with receiving food. But in this case, in this example, pressing that lever leads to food, and therefore that is kind of the response behavior that Skinner is looking for. So looking more broadly at reinforcement, the concept of reinforcement as it exists in operant conditioning. Again, in that example, pressing the bar is a type of response, and this is also called the operant, hence operant conditioning. And the food is what we refer to as the reinforcer. And so reinforcer is something that reinforces the behavior, that gets it to continue happening. And there are two types of reinforcers. There's natural reinforcers and secondary reinforcers. And the natural reinforcers are things like food, water, sex, and etc. And these are things that don't need to be learned to be reinforced. So people naturally want these, hence natural reinforcement. And this is the primary method of reinforcement. The secondary reinforcement is provided by learned reinforcers, or what we term learned reinforcers. And that is things that we associate value with, but don't inherently have value or necessity in our lives. So an example is money. And money is paper. It has no intrinsic value, but we have learned that with money we can exchange that for other forms of reinforcement, primary, natural reinforcement, or other things that we enjoy. And so these learned reinforcers, or these secondary reinforcement, can help people learn behaviors as well. If you do well, you get money, things of that sort. And there are two types of reinforcement. The first is positive reinforcement. In positive reinforcement, you get something. So positive reinforcement focuses on a reward or event that makes it more likely that a type of response will be repeated. So in the example that we used of the rat, the food is the positive reinforcement. Every time the rat pressed the lever, it got food, and that positive reinforcement increased the likelihood that the rat would press the lever again, because the rat wants to eat. The rat likes food. So the positive reinforcement, that is getting something, getting food. And so this positive reinforcement happens time and time again. It increases the likelihood that the rat will press the lever. On the flip side of that, we have negative reinforcement, which is when you take something away. It is the removal of an aversive event to encourage behavior. So it's not necessarily, it just thinks it's better off to just think of it as removal of something. So imagine that there's a rat in the same box, but the cage floor is electrified. And in order to stop the electrification, the rat can press on a bar. And so the rat does press on the bar, and it turns off the electrical charge. So the removal of the negative experience, the aversive event, in this case shock, is a type of reward, is a type of reinforcement for the rat. So again, the rat's on this electrified floor. It learns that if it presses the bar, the electrical charge turns off. The taking away of something, that negative reinforcement, the removal of that negative experience, is itself a reward. So those are the two types. You have positive and negative reinforcements. And those are important to make the distinction between. Again, positive is when you get something. Negative is when you take something away. There's also something known as omission training. In omission training, you try to decrease the likelihood or the frequency of a behavior, and you do that by withholding rewards until you get the desired behavior demonstrated. So that's what we have going on for omission training. It is worth noting that when people are doing operant conditioning, they follow what are known as schedules. And schedules of reinforcement, or schedules in psychology, is talking about how often something receives reinforcement for their response. So there's different types of reinforcement. There's continuous reinforcement. And that means that every correct response results in a reward. So every time that rat presses that lever, they get food. This continuous reinforcement is really effective for producing rapid learning. People learn really, really quickly. But it also results in a rapid extinction. And again, just a reminder, extinction, we talked about it in classical conditioning as well. But it's a decrease or disappearance of response once that behavior is no longer reinforced. So when they stop getting the food, they're not going to press that lever as often. And that's going to be more quick if you do continuous reinforcement. So every single time you press the lever, you get food. That is a continuous reinforcement. It makes them learn quickly, but the learning doesn't necessarily stick for as long. Other types of schedule could be something called a partial or intermittent reinforcement schedule. And that's when not every response is reinforced. And so one of those, there's a few different ways you could do. One's called a fixed ratio. So the reward occurs after a certain number of responses. So a rat may have to press the lever 10 times in order to get the food pellet. So it knows that when it presses it 10 times, it gets food. 10 more food, 10 more food, 10 more food. This produces really strong learning as well. But again, they recognize when food is no longer reinforced, when their behavior is no longer getting reinforced, when they are no longer getting food or whatever it is, the learning extinguishes fairly quickly. So any of these types of schedules where they get it fairly often or regularly leads to strong and relatively fast learning, but quick extinction. You also have something called a variable ratio schedule, where the ratio of responses to reinforcement is not predictable. So an example of this is a slot machine. You put in money, you pull the lever, the reinforcement is payoff, but it's done randomly. Reinforcement can come at any time. Again, with the rat, you could just set a random number. The first time it could be 3 pulls of the lever, then it could be 20, then it could be 7, then 8, then 1, then 10, then 12. And it's random. They don't know when that reinforcement's coming, but they do know the reinforcement is coming. And so this type of schedule, it may take longer for people to acquire the learning, but the learning that is created is much more resistant to that extinction because it's so reinforced and the response is so well conditioned. 2 other types of schedules are one's called a fixed interval schedule, where reinforcement is presented after fixed periods of time, as long as there is one response. So the example of this is a salaried worker, right? You get a paycheck every 2 weeks. That is a fixed interval schedule. As long as you show up at least once to work, or whatever it may be, however many times you have to, you get that paycheck. Likewise, maybe you give the rat a food pellet every hour, provided they press the lever at least once an hour. That way they know, hey, I've got to go press a lever, and then at the end of the hour, I'll get food. A variable interval schedule, reinforcement is presented at differing time intervals as long as there's at least one response. Again, same idea as a variable ratio schedule, but we're using time, right? So maybe you get a paycheck once a week, maybe you get it once a month, maybe you get it every other week. It just shows up kind of randomly. It's at different times. The same thing with the rat. As long as the rat is pressing the lever at least once in a given time, it gets something. And that time may be 30 minutes, it may be 15 minutes, it may be an hour. It could all switch, and they don't know. This makes learning much more difficult to extinguish instead of fixed schedules, because again, they want to keep the learning, keep doing the action, because they never know when that reinforcement will come. And so that encourages them to continue doing so. It really strengthens their learning. We have also, in addition to reinforcement, we have punishment. So punishment is important in operant condition, and the effect is opposite of reinforcement. So you have 2 things. You have reinforcement and punishment. And both of them have positives and negatives. Okay, so I want to make sure that we know that. They're both positives. Reinforcement can be positive and negative reinforcement, and punishment can be positive and negative reinforcement as well. And punishment is the idea that a behavior is followed by a consequence, and that decreases the likelihood that the behavior is repeated. Okay? So in positive punishment, again, it's the application, it's adding something. It's pairing of a negative stimulus with a behavior. So if you're in the military and you speak out of turn in boot camp, you have to do push-ups. It's adding something. This is the positive, the plus side of the number line. You are adding something for them to do. The negative punishment is when you remove a reinforcing stimulus. So if a kid breaks a window, they lose TV for a week. So positive punishment adds, negative punishment subtracts. You get in trouble for doing something, the negative punishment is taking away your cell phone. Or you get in trouble for talking back. The positive punishment is you get hit, right? Those are, and be careful, positive and negative don't mean good and bad. It means adding versus subtracting. So those are key things to remember as we talk about punishment and reinforcement. Punishment and reinforcement often used together in order to push learning behaviors, or when we are just naturally learning, that happens. It is important to know that punishment generally does not last as long as reinforcement does. So reinforcement is significantly better for long-term learning. Once you stop punishing, it's no longer effective. It's effective in the moment, but not for long-term learning. And again, I think this is a real key difference right here. Punishment instructs what not to do, but reinforcement teaches what to do. So that's the difference, right? Punishment just says, no, you shouldn't have done that. Reinforcement says, this is what you should do. And so that's a real big difference as we move forward through learning and psychology. Therefore, because of this, reinforcement is a better alternative to encourage behavioral changes in learning. So if we want people to change their bad behaviors, we should do reinforcement more than we should do punishment. It just lasts longer. The effects are more long-term and more effective. Again, the last thing here is processes that we describe for classical conditioning: acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery. Those sorts of things also occur in operant conditioning as well. So those occur with reinforcement as well as with punishment. They show up in the same thing. Learning is essentially learning. There's just different kind of approaches to it. A couple of things that show up in operant conditioning are escape and avoidance. And escape is when a person learns how to get away from an aversive stimulus or something they don't want to do by engaging in a particular behavior. And this reinforces the behavior so that they're not willing to participate again. So an example of that is if a child doesn't want to eat his vegetables, that is their aversive stimulus. That is what they don't want to do. They throw a temper tantrum. And if the parents allow that child to get away with not eating vegetables, the child learns that behaving that way is an escape. And that by doing that behavior, they can avoid that particular aversive stimulus, that thing that they don't want to do. If they throw a temper tantrum, they don't have to do it. And then that can go on to stimulus generalization. And they can think, if there is something I do not want to do, I throw this temper tantrum and I don't have to do it. And that's why escape is such a problem and it can be so dangerous. Because again, it reinforces a behavior that says, if I do this, I get to avoid something I don't want to do. And that's important. And then, and so that helps them escape the behavior. And the other one is avoidance. So a person performs a behavior to make sure that that aversive stimulus, that thing they do not want to do, is not even presented to them as an option. So in this case, a child, before they even are asked to eat the vegetables, they see their mom cooking them. And they think to themselves, I don't want to eat those vegetables. How can I avoid this? I can pretend I'm sick. And by pretending I'm sick, my mom will send me to bed, give me some crackers and some ginger ale, and I don't have to eat those vegetables. So the child avoids all confrontation. It doesn't even have to deal with the aversive stimulus. They don't have to deal with anything they don't want to deal with. They escape that entirely. So that is avoidance. And these are real dangers for children because if they work, the child is reinforced that performing escape and avoidance will benefit them in the long run. So it's important to know that, and that's not just for child, that's for any learning. They recognize if I perform this behavior, I won't have to do this. So escape and avoidance are important. We use operant conditioning oftentimes where we have controlled populations, prisons, mental institutions, schools, things like that. In general, these places run on what's called a token economy, and that's an artificial economy based off something. And these tokens are secondary reinforcers. They're not primary reinforcers, but they can be used for purchasing primary reinforcers. And so people who are participating in these token economies get reinforced with those. So if you do something properly at the end of the week, like if you're well behaved at the end of the week, you get these things. For example, in elementary school classrooms, often there are clip charts. And if you are a good student the whole week, at the end of the week, you get to choose something from the prize bucket. And that is their reinforcement. If I behaved well, I get a token or a ticket. The ticket allows me to choose something from the prize bucket, which is something I want. So again, and this is designed to increase the number of positive behaviors that occur. If the child knows and is thinking, I want to draw from the bucket, they will behave properly rather than misbehave. And then the last thing we'll talk about is sometimes with operant conditioning, we can develop something called learned helplessness. And this is when consistent effort by people fails to bring a reward. So if someone is trying and trying and trying and constantly failing, eventually the subject is likely to stop trying entirely. Martin Seligman was the first person to discover this, and he does it by putting, and this is terrible, but putting dogs in a room with an electrified floor, and dogs tried to escape until they realized that there was nothing they could do to avoid the shock, and then they eventually just gave up on trying to escape altogether. And Seligman transitions this to human behavior as well, and sees this as possibly being a precursor to depression in humans, saying that if people try at work, at school, at relationships, at friendships, at what family, whatever it may be, and find that no matter what they do, they're still failing, they're still not successful, then perhaps depression results from that. So that is what he calls learned helplessness, is that they learn that no matter how hard they try, they can't get anything done properly, and because of this could eventually lead to depression. And so that's just kind of a quick look at operant conditioning as it stands in the way we learn.